words to guide and direct our lives in service to you. For we pray in Jesus' blessed name. Amen. Well, all right, everyone. The parables are drawing to a close, but this one this morning is a very important parable. And although it's short in the number of verses that it actually occupies in the Bible, there's some really deep and rich meaning that we can garner from it. So to begin this morning, I'd like to set the context. We're going to be reading in Matthew chapter 7, but prior to that, I'm going to remind you that this is the end of what we normally think of as the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount, imagine that Jesus has gone out into the wilderness. Now, he didn't go to Buckley or to Kingsley or a little town and have people gather around. No, he went out into the desert, out onto a mountaintop or a mountainside, if you will. And the people started coming to him. And he began teaching them. And his teachings were amazing to them. They had never heard anybody speak like this before. And the longer he spoke, the more the people came. And the longer he spoke, the more the people came. And finally, there's a multitude of people. And that's the way that the Bible actually describes it. A multitude of people. The Sermon on the Mount was perhaps the greatest sermon ever spoken. It's been referred to as one of the greatest orations that's ever been recorded or written about. The Sermon on the Mount. As Jesus teaches them, and his teachings are drawing to a close, he ends by sharing with them a few thoughts. And one of them is, do not judge. Don't judge. And then he tells them, take the beam out of your own eye so that you can see to take the mote out of your brother's eye. In other words, shed the sin in your life so that you might be able to help a brother who is struggling as well. And don't forget, do not judge. He tells them, ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. And he reminds them of the first law. And he reminds them of whatsoever things that you would have men do unto you, do unto them. Don't wait. Do to them what you wish them to do unto you. And then he tells them, enter in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth unto destruction, and many enter in there. For strait is the gate and narrow is the way that leadeth unto life, and few find it. And then the admonition. Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them. And his final words are, not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven. That's the setting, and that's the context, and that's the admonition that he leaves them with as he begins this parable. Janine, verses 24 through 27, please.
Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine
Is this a parable? Is this a parable? Does it fit our definition of a parable? It doesn't begin, and the kingdom of heaven is like. It doesn't say, this is a parable. So is it a parable? Well, it certainly appears so, doesn't it? Because it's an illustration that's going to make a point or help us come to a better understanding. Who is the audience this morning? When Jesus shares these words, this parable, who is the audience? Everyone. Specifically, who's the audience? From the Bible, who's there? Teachers of the law. Yeah, the religious leaders are there. Who else? What's that? Disciples are there. Yes. Who else? Other Jews and Gentiles. Or the big word that the Bible used, the really big all-inclusive word? Multitude. Yes. So that's the audience. How about you and I today? Of course. But for the purposes of the parable itself, Jesus is not only speaking to his disciples, he's speaking to the multitudes. And within the multitudes are the religious leaders as well. Janine, I want you to read verse 24 for us again, please. Everybody know what that means? Therefore. And what would Tim say? Therefore a reason. What went before? Therefore, all of these things I've told you, therefore what? Whosoever heareth. This is an important touchstone for this parable. Who hears? Who hears? Question to you then. Will everyone hear? No. Is the entire population of the world there? No, but there's a multitude there. And yet of the multitude, will they all hear? No, I see some shaking their head. Why not? Why will they not hear? Well, some may choose to stay away, but others, their hearts will have been hardened. In fact, the prophets tell us not everybody is going to hear because their hearts have been hardened. Their hearts have become dull. They will neither hear and understand, nor will they see and believe, because their hearts have been hardened. Another important point for us to consider. It's almost as if they say, no, wait, Jesus, I came out to hear. What about this doeth part? There are going to be some there that are going to be challenged when Jesus said, you must be doers of the word, not simply hearers, but doers. In fact, the prophets say, if you don't do, if you only hear and you don't do, you didn't really hear. So he who doeth them. Do you really expect me to do all these things, Jesus? I mean, I marched 27 miles out into the desert to hear you on the mountain here, and it's hot, and it's dry, and it's a terrible setting, and my feet are sore, and I'm dirty from walking, and now you're going to have me do this whole list of things that included the whole Sermon on the Mount? You expect me to do it as well as just hear it? All of them? Or just some of them? What does Jesus say? It's almost as if you can hear Christ say, my son, What did I just tell you? What did I just tell you? If you hear and do, I will liken you unto a wise man who built his house upon the rock. What's a house? Why did Jesus use, he built his house upon the rock? Is that what your translation says, by the way? House? Some of them say dwelling, but what is a house? What's a house? A residence. Important. What is a house? Where you live. Security. I mean, we can write a whole list up here, but let me suggest one more word for you to think about. A house really is a dwelling. That's where you go. That's where you reside for all of these other things. It's a dwelling place. So where are you going to build your dwelling place? A wise man will build it upon the rock. On our Wednesday night class, Matthew brought us a video from the Palestine area, and he showed us very graphically a wadi. You remember that class? Some of you were there. I want you to imagine a dry stream bed. And you can tell how wide the stream bed is because there's nothing growing in it. It's just covered with sand. And in that particular area of the world, it's not the fine beach sand that we have on Lake Michigan. It's rough, coarse bits of rock that have been crushed and ground up, and they're sharp. And then above that, you'll see the rock and the shelf go up and into the mountains. That wadi is often flooded every year. Now, sometimes they'll miss a year. There won't be a flood this year. There won't be enough rains in the mountains to flood it. But when it does flood, the water is going to come rushing down that wadi, and you're going to think to yourself, how could that be? It was bone dry and nothing there, and now it's rushing full of water. So it reminds me of when Margaret and I lived in Arizona. We moved out there to the desert of southern Arizona, and we're driving along the highway, and here's the big yellow sign, and it says, "Watch for floods." And I thought, this is a joke. Who drove that sign out here in the middle of the desert? But if you look out, you see a wadi, or an arroyo, as they call it out there. It's just a broad, sandy basin. But when it rains in the mountains, and it only rains about once a year during the rainy season, those waters all rush together. They can't soak in. They rush together, and by now they're coming down that wadi, that dry wash, if you will, and right across the highway. And every year it wipes out a car, it pushes somebody over the edge, it often floats the car or turns the car over, and people die. And an hour later, there's barely any water in it again. What's the point here? The point here is the wise man doesn't build his house on the sand. He builds it above the wadi. He builds it on the rock. The rock or the cap rock between us. Janine, verse 25, please.
The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock.
It was founded, I should make that in brown. It was founded on the rock. Now imagine we're going to build a skyscraper. We can't just go out here and dig down 42 inches and put our footing in and build a skyscraper. It won't hold up. It'll topple over. We need it anchored to the bedrock. We need it anchored to a firm foundation, an unmovable foundation. Any of you old enough to remember them building the Mackinac Bridge? Yeah, as kids, we used to go up there and we'd stop and we would camp. There's a campsite right there at the base of it. We watched them build that bridge. It took forever for them to build those piers. But why? Because they had to build dams or dikes, if you will, earth, remove all the earth and go all the way down to bedrock. And so the Mackinac Bridge actually sits on bedrock. It's firm. It's not going to move. It's going to hold up all that weight. Anybody been out on Lake Michigan in a storm? By choice or otherwise? And can we get a storm on Lake Michigan? Everybody nod their head up and down. Yes, we can. And guess what? The Mackinac Bridge still stands because it's anchored on the bedrock. A wise man is going to build his house upon the rock. The next slide, or the next set of the video that Matthew showed us, is here's the wadi with no water in it, and then the next picture, the very next picture, here comes all the water. And it's like a wall of water coming, folks, and it comes fast and it comes hard. Out in Arizona, quite often, it would have a log and debris and all kinds of stuff in it that got washed down out of the mountains, and this mighty wall of water would come. And yet, the wise man built his house upon the rock, above those rushing floods. The wind beat against it, the rain comes, but it stands. In this parable, imagine the parable now. What would the multitudes, the people that actually attended, what would they envision when Jesus starts telling them about the wise man building his house upon the rock? Yeah, Jan says an actual house. I want you to imagine that you've walked out into the desert and you've gone up onto the mount where Jesus is speaking. Chances are you could look over his shoulder, right or left, and you could see a wadi. If you're up high and looking down at the desert floor, they're very obvious. They're very plain to see. They look like dry riverbeds. Some of the people that attended may have actually walked across the wadi in order to get there. This would have been an example, an illustration that they all could identify with. And in fact, some of them may have known of people who didn't build their house far enough off from that sand. And in a bigger year with more flooding, it might have taken down a structure or swept away their sheep or cattle or whatever. But they all would have been aware of it. Read 26 and 27, Janine, please.
But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash.
Everyone who heareth these words of mine and doeth them not. Well, wait, Jesus, we came a long way out in the desert to hear you, but you really going to ask us to do what you've told us to do? Yeah. You shall be likened unto a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. If you don't do what I've told you to do, if you don't build your house upon the rock, if you don't follow my commands, then you'll be like a man who built his house upon the sand. And when the rains came, and will rains come? Yes. And when the floodwaters rose, will there be floodwaters? Yes. And when the wind blows, will there be wind? Yes. And will it beat upon the house? Yes. And the house will fall. The dwelling, the place where you not only keep your stuff, but that you live and where your family lives, your shelter, your protection, your security, it will fall. It will fall. Now I want you to remember Jesus' admonition before he began this parable. listen carefully. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven. Very likely the multitudes can see a wadi from where Jesus is speaking, looking down on the desert floor. Very likely some of them walked. They have a very graphic picture of what Jesus has just told them. And now he's relating that. They begin to realize it's not just about building a house. It's much more. Remember, he's just told them, don't judge. Doeth the will of my Father. Don't judge. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Doeth the will of my Father. Take the beam out of your own eye so that you can see to remove the mote out of your brother's eye. Doeth. Seek, and ye shall find. Ask, and ye shall receive. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. Doeth the will of my Father. And finally, enter in at the straight gate. For narrow is the way, and few that will find it. Doeth the will of my Father. And finally, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits will you know them. Janine, yes.
Also, I believe that the storms represent circumstances of life.
Yes. So in application, what Jan is saying is that the storms represent,
Circumstances of life.
just as the rain, just as the wind, the floods, they're coming. They're coming. Jesus doesn't say if a storm should happen by. They're coming. There will. But where does the wise man build his house? Upon the rock. Janine, I need you to read now 28 and 29, although it's not part of the parable, generally thought of that, but read 28 and 29.
When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law.
Not as the what? We've had these guys with us forever, but never have we heard them speaking Jesus like you've just taught us. You've shown us using everyday things and explained yourself to us so that we understand we need to build our house upon the rock. Yes.
Mine, it says, that when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Mm-hmm. And did you hear, Jan? It not as their teachers of the law, and my translation actually says as the scribes, or those who would have recorded the law, memorized the law and recorded the law. Same thought there. broader, and this is why it's good sometimes for us to look at different translations. It gives us a little better meaning. But let's talk about the rock for a moment. What does the rock represent? Yeah, everybody's saying Jesus, but before we go there, let me suggest to you that the rock suggests the foundation. Everybody jump up and down in their seat, a couple of times. It's solid underneath of us, right? It's the foundation upon which the wise man is going to build his house. So the deeper meaning than just the four walls of a dwelling place, but the foundation upon which he's to build his house. A place where your dwelling will withstand the rains and the winds and the storms that are sure to come. I want everyone to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Fifth book in. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4. Who has that and can read that for us? Go ahead, Kathy.
He is a rock, his works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does not wrong, upright and just as he.
Anybody have a different translation? Reads pretty much, yes, Mary Jo.
He is the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice, righteous and upright is he.
Excellent. My King James says, and he is the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are judgment. A God of truth and without iniquity, just and right is he. Who's the rock? Yeah. By whom were all things created? Jesus, yes. Who is the truth, the way, the truth, the life? If we're going to build our dwelling place upon the firm foundation, we want to build it upon the rock. If you go to the teens class, when we had the boys and girls together and we were doing the teens class, if you lifted up the front cover of every one of their workbooks, it says, the rock. It's Jesus. It's the foundation. It's where the wise man will build his dwelling. Upon everything will that stand. What are the pillars of the church? Upon what is the church built? The pillars, the foundation, they're built on Jesus. And Jesus' teachings, they're the lessons of life. Now everyone turn to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 23. I double-checked my scriptures this time because I had one wrong about 2 weeks ago. Verse 3. Yep. Got that, Anita? Yeah. Can you read that for us?
The God of Israel spoke. The rock of Israel said to me, when one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God.
Interesting, it's referred to as the rock of what? The rock of Israel. Why is Israel referred to God as the chosen people? It's through the lineage of Abraham, to whom received the promise. Everyone is going to benefit because your nation is going to be as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, innumerable. And from your lineage will be the Messiah. God will send his redeeming Son through your lineage. To Israel was the first promise. The rock, the foundation. Who spoke to the prophets? From that verse right there, who spoke to the prophets? God did. There are literally, we're running out of time. There are literally dozens of references to the rock in the Old Testament. I want you to remember Matthew's big statue of the guy, and the gold and the silver and the brass and the bronze and the feet of iron and clay. What broke down that statue? A rock carved out of the mountain without hands is going to break down that statue. What is going to destroy that idol worship? What is going to put down that nation? It's the rock. It's the stumbling block to some who don't believe, who won't hear, who won't do. But to others, it becomes the chief cornerstone. Upon what do we build the house? Upon what do we build our dwelling? Upon the rock. The foundation that won't move. Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and when? Forever. It's immovable. That's where the wise man is going to build his house. Not on the shifting sand, not where the swirling waters, the flood, will beat against it, and great will be the fall of it, but built upon the rock that never moves. I want you now to listen to one more verse, and I'll read it for you. We're running out of time. And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Jesus asked Peter a very simple question. Who do men say that I am? And then he said, Peter, who do you say that I am? And what was Peter's response? Thou art the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. That is the rock. That is the foundation. And it will never move. And it will never be moved. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. In the day of judgment, will the rock still stand? And what will happen to those who have chosen not to be fruitful, not to be doers of the word? They're going to be cast into outer darkness. And where so many of our other parables have ended, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. He who heareth and doeth the will of my Father, that is the rock. This is the lesson for you folks today. There will be winds. There will be rains. There will be floods and all of those things that they represent. Yet your dwelling house will stand if you build your house upon the rock. Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, you've sent your Son Jesus to give us the words of life. You've shown us by his example what it means to love. May our hearts be right with you. May our dwelling be built upon the rock of thy salvation, that we may stand against the winds and the waves and the storms of life, faithful unto the end, fruitful in your service. For it is in the name of your Son, Jesus, the rock, that we ask these blessings. Amen. Thank you, everyone.